Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be killing two birds with one stone. Primarily we're going to be reviewing the newly released Asobo Orbx Fokker F7, and whilst we're doing that we're also going to be taking a look at World Update 7. World Update 7 of course focusing on Australia. There's a whole host of changes as usual: improved terrain mesh, improved photo imagery, photogrammetry cities, as well as numerous points of interest. The Fokker F7 released alongside World Update 7 as part of Asobo's Local Legends series. Initially I thought the choice of aircraft was a little bit strange alongside the Australia update, but it turns out the Fokker F7 actually has quite a lot of history with one particular Australian individual. The aircraft actually went on to achieve quite a lot of world firsts in aviation under the pilotage of Sir Charles Kingsford Smith. Whilst making this video it actually inspired me to go away and read up on some of his history. If you're into your aviation history then I highly recommend going and doing the same. There's some very interesting stories behind his endeavours. The purpose of today's flight though, we're not going to be recreating any of those adventures. We're going to be taking a full review look at the aircraft. As usual we'll be taking a look at the modelling, the texturing, the flight model, the sounds, the systems. We'll initially start here on the ground at Point Cook Airfield just out to the south of Melbourne. Sir Charles Kingsford Smith actually departed from Point Cook on his Trans-Tasman crossing. Whilst we're here we'll be taking a look at the aircraft's texturing and modelling. We'll discuss a few points on the systems as well. And then we'll be heading over to Sydney for our flight. We'll take a lap around the city and get more of a feel for the aircraft's flight model. Anyway guys, as always I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Once again, if nothing else, Asobo, this time in conjunction with Orbx, have managed to produce another beautiful rendition of an aircraft. So let's continue on with our tour. So as I mentioned during the introduction, the Fokker F7 seems to be a collaboration between Asobo and Orbx. I'm not entirely sure which developer is responsible for which features on the aircraft, but again, overall it's a very beautiful rendition of the aircraft that we have in front of us. Having looked at some pictures, the product seems to be a very accurate rendition of the Fokker F7. And as usual with Asobo's aircraft, the quality in terms of the modelling is very high. I will say though that the quality of the model perhaps just slightly lower than the usual Asobo standards. There are a couple of areas that look a little bit rough. External texturing throughout the aircraft I really like. I think the textures look great, the colours look great. The PBR in particular looks pretty spot on. Most of the aircraft surfaces look very photorealistic. Again, I think the modelling detail is very good and nothing really exemplifies that better than the modelling of the aircraft's engines. They're a real pleasure to look at, actually, very finely detailed, very interesting. So indeed, overall I think the modelling definitely gets a thumbs up. As I say though, unlike some of Asobo's previous efforts, there are some rougher edges. You can see for example around the cowling here on the centre engine. That could be accurate to the real world aircraft. Obviously the Fokker F7's pretty vintage. I'm sure that back when the aircraft was produced, manufacturing and machining techniques were still fairly crude, and so it's certainly plausible that some of the panels may not line up exactly. Interestingly as well, the Fokker F7 apparently partially open cockpit, so definitely an aircraft only for the brave. Anyway, on that note, let's head for the cockpit and we'll see what we find there. So coming now into the cockpit of the Fokker F7, again overall a pretty decent effort from Asobo and Orbx. I will say though I don't think the cockpit is done as nicely as the externals of the aircraft, and also again not up to Asobo's usual standards. For the most part the cockpit certainly still looks nice, the texturing is pretty decent. The gauges are probably where I take the most issue. Overall they're not too bad, but they do look just a little bit too neat and tidy, the way they've been fitted into the panel there. Again, those details could well be accurate to the real world F7, but I'd be surprised if the gauges sat quite that flush with the panel, and there doesn't appear to be any glass on the gauges either. On the subject of gauges, that was one of the first disappointing aspects I found with the aircraft. We'll touch more on it again later on, but overall the systems and the gauges on the aircraft pretty hit and miss. For example, the compass down here on our left, that seems to be pretty crudely modelled. Again, I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's period accurate, but my instinct would tell me probably not. Similarly, you can see there's a little curved white bar just below the wooden protrusion on the right side of the panel. That looks awfully familiar, it looks very similar to the slip indicator on the Vickers Vimy, so I highly suspect we should have a balance ball there and that's not modelled. Again, we'll touch more on the gauges once we start the aircraft up, but the overall systems fidelity of the aircraft seems to be a little bit lacking. The modelling and texturing is pretty consistent throughout the cockpit though, even the more hidden away areas look pretty nice. Obviously the modelling's pretty Spartan in the F7 cockpit, but the aircraft is pretty Spartan in general. Another slightly disappointing aspect of the product, the cabin has actually been modelled, which is nice to see, but Try as I may, I haven't actually been able to get in there via the cockpit camera. It seems to be that there's a bit of an invisible wall stopping you from moving into the cabin. We can, however, get into the cabin via the drone camera, and as you can see it's been quite nicely modelled, so a little bit of a shame that we can't visit from the flight deck. On the Southern Cross variant of the F7 we've got what I assume is the large centre fuel tank there, sat just behind the cockpit, and a couple of seats as well for the other members of the crew. We have in fact got all of the essentials on board for those longer flights, and again it's a little bit of a shame that Asobo and Orbx didn't allow us to readily see the details that they've gone and put into the aircraft. One really nice feature with the package, we do actually get multiple variants of the aircraft. We get both the Fokker F7 M3, which we've just taken a look at, the tri-motor variant of the aircraft. We also get the M1, which is the single engine variant of the Fokker F7. It's actually the original variant of the aircraft designed by Fokker. Further to that, we also get ski and float variants of the aircraft, so a nice amount of variety for the fairly small price that Asobo are asking for the package. Again, all of the detailing in terms of texturing and modelling, very nice on all of the variants that you'll get with the product. The changes aren't just different externally, you'll also get quite a different cockpit with the M1. Once again, that's been pretty nicely modelled and textured. I would actually say I think the cockpit in the M1 is slightly better than in the M3. The cockpit controls also seem to be a little bit more complete. As with the M3, unfortunately we can't get into the cabin of the M1 via the cockpit, but again, using the drone cam you can see it's actually been modelled very nicely. On the M1 we have a rather beautiful period authentic KLM cabin interior. As I say, I just think it's a shame that we can't more easily access these nice details that the developers have gone to the effort of modelling. Lastly, in terms of variants, we also get a more modern retrofitted version of the aircraft. Again, it's been nicely modelled, nicely textured. You can see we've replaced the wooden props there with some more modern metal ones. The cockpit's had a complete overhaul as well. We have a modern suite of gauges and avionics. And the cockpit controls, once again on the retrofitted version, do seem to be a little bit more complete than on the vintage version of the M3. Personally, I found the textures on the retrofitted version to be a little bit weak in some areas. For example, here on the engine control levers, the texture's not quite up to modern standards. Similarly, we've got the Orbx logo there on the rudder pedals. Fair enough, I suppose. I don't know whether or not there is actually a retrofitted version of the F7 in reality, but I'd rather keep the textures as realistic as possible. And once again, we have a decent cabin interior on the aircraft, although despite the cockpit door being fully open this time, we're still seemingly unable to access the cabin via the cockpit, so again you're looking at the view via the drone cam. On that note, I haven't managed to find a way yet to open up any of the aircraft's doors, so that's a little bit of a shame. Ultimately, whilst it is a small feature and it's not something that bothers me personally, it's certainly quite a minimal detail that you'd expect really from any add-on these days. We'll touch more on the aircraft systems throughout the flight, but I just wanted to point out one error ahead of time. In front of us we have the aircraft's fuel control panel. You can see that the port tank control works absolutely fine. Neither of the centre tank controls actually works, and bizarrely the starboard tank control actually actuates the centre tanks whilst not working itself. In terms of the engine starters, both the starboard and one of the centre starters works. The port starter works as well, but the other centre starter not modelled for some reason. Anyway, of course the best way to demonstrate most of these things is going to be to head to the cockpit. We'll get ourselves sat down and comfortable in the cockpit of the Fokker F7. So welcome to the cockpit of the Fokker F7. We're on the ground at Sydney's Kingsford Smith International Airport. Again, I thought by far the most appropriate place that we could take the aircraft for a flight today. You can see downtown Sydney off in the distance there, that's where we're going to be taking the aircraft. We're going to tour the new scenery from the World Update. Running through our pre-flight checklist, the chocks. There is actually a little panel that you can click on to add or remove the chocks, which is a nice touch, although there's no actual indication as to whether they've been fitted or not, so it can get a little bit confusing. Anyway, the chocks are in place, fuel valves are closed, throttles are set idle, magnetos are off. Doors, again unfortunately as far as I can tell we can't operate the doors in the aircraft, but as per the checklist they are closed and locked. And flight controls. Are full free and in the correct sense. On the fuel panel the starboard tank needs to go on. Again we've discussed the bug there, it seems currently inoperable. Centre tanks are on and the port tank is on. One other issue with the aircraft currently, you can't actually start the engines without increasing the mixture. I've checked throughout the cockpit for a mixture lever for each engine. I can't find one, I might be missing something, but I found I've had to use my hardware controls to adjust the mixture settings. So coming up on the mixtures, otherwise the engines won't start. We'll be starting the number 3 engine first. So the number 3 magneto can go to both. Another issue in the cockpit, you actually can't click on the magneto selectors without first removing the yoke. You'll see if I try and move the selector there, currently nothing's happening. If we remove the yokes, then the magneto selector is operable, so a little bit of an issue there, I would say. Anyway, number 3 magneto is set to both. Throttle will just crack. Prop area appears to be clear. We'll have our first officer give everybody a shout.
Clear prop.
I'm going to gauge the starter. So somewhat meek start sounds there, not too much from the engine. The engine fired pretty quickly as well. Anyway, we do have a good start on the number 3. And you can see the oil temperature has come up there. The gauges are a little bit confusing. We have oil temperature here, which I assume would be oil pressure, given that the other 2 gauges are reading pressure. And then again we have oil temperature down below. That could just be me reading them wrong, but a little bit strange. Anyway, good start on the number 3. We'll start the number 2 engine, so the centre engine. Once again, mags can go to both. The throttle itself is cracked. Prop area is clear. And we'll get the centre engine starter on. And a good start there on the number 2. The engine's idle pretty high as well. I'm not sure whether or not that's accurate to the real world aircraft. I've got just a tiny bit of throttle in there at the moment. We're already up at 1800 RPM. We'll talk more about that in a moment's time. If I come back all the way to idle on the throttles there, we're idling around 1450, 1400 RPM. Anyway, we do have 2 good starts. We'll head outside. We'll just look at the start sequence again externally so that you can hear the engine startup sounds from outside. And once we have 3 good starts, the engine's running and nice and warm, we'll come back to the flight deck and we'll make our way out towards the runway. Okay, so we do have all 3 engines running. I think a few points to note. I would say the aircraft currently is definitely best started using Control E. I found earlier when I manually started the engines that the RPM gauges were reading very strangely. As I said, just a very small input and would be up at rather high RPM. Even about quarter throttle would basically be up at maximum deflection there on the RPM gauges. They seem to be responding quite normally now though, now that we've done the Control E start. Similarly, once again on the oil pressure and temperature gauges, so on the left there, the gauge stating oil pressure and PSI, we've got about 40 PSI. In the centre gauge there, about 50 PSI. And the right gauge states temperature in degrees Celsius. We're showing about 65 there. I assume again that would be oil pressure though, since we've got 3 temperature gauges down the bottom. On the bottom set of gauges we've got 70, I presume, degrees Celsius. On the centre gauge we've got about 82, and the same on the right there. So again, it could be my lack of understanding of the aircraft, but with no documentation it's pretty difficult to say. I assume though there's a few issues there with the gauges. Anyway, again we do have 3 good starts. We'll carry out a run up just on the centre engine. We'll come fully back on the yoke. The checklist actually calls for us to come up to 2500 RPM, but I find that the aircraft wants to tip over on its chocks if we do that, so we'll come up to 2000 RPM. Says 2000. Again, we're going to have to remove the yokes to check the magnetos. It's onto the right mag. And we've got about 25 RPM drop there. Back to both. And onto the left. Same drop there. And back to both, and we're back up to 2000 RPM. Once again, we'll reinstate the yokes. Just checking the engine temperatures and pressures. Everything looking good there. You can see the needles are all in the same position, so I think it's just the fact that the gauge scales are different there, which is a bit odd. Anyway, we'll come back to idle on the throttles. And the engine's now idling around 650 RPM as opposed to around 1400 before when we did the manual start process. So we can remove the chocks. We'll make our way out towards the runway. It's a nice short taxi, just out at 1 o'clock. Again, we'll come fully back on the stick. The Fokker F7 actually has a tail skid, so it's going to be pretty interesting to see how the aircraft handles on the ground. And seems to be pretty true to life. We don't really have any steering there, having to just jab the brakes to get the aircraft turned. So there's no tail wheel steering modelled or anything like that for the sake of simplicity. So just be advised, the aircraft will probably be a little bit of a handful on the ground. That's nice to see. Again, it's authentic to the aircraft. And we got the threshold for runway 07 just off the 11 o'clock position. We're going to have to preempt the turn a little bit here to use the brakes to get the aircraft turned. It's all clear upwind. And you may have spotted the windsock just a moment ago. We've got a pretty decent headwind off runway 07. It's all clear on final. And as I say, we're just going to take a bit of a scenic tour out towards the city. We'll do a lap around downtown Sydney, check out the various landmarks. Obviously we're going to feel for the aircraft as we go, and then we'll head back towards the airfield. Okay, so we're all set and ready to go. It did occur to me we're just holding the aircraft on the brakes at the moment, and I would imagine in actuality that the Fokker F7 probably not fitted with any brakes, but of course that's a reasonable concession for the sim. It may be that the aircraft was, I didn't see any on the external model. Anyway, we'll carry out the takeoff. We'll just talk through a few things before we go, as it's going to get a little bit bizarre in just a moment's time. The checklist calls for 2050 on the RPMs for the takeoff. We can certainly achieve more than that with the engines, but we'll go with that. We should get on okay. And according again to the checklist, we need at least 112 kilometers an hour before we rotate. Just keep a good eye on the airspeed there. The gauge is actually in kilometers an hour. And you'll see it's not going to be my finest takeoff by any lengths of the imagination. The aircraft is very strange in terms of its handling characteristics. All I can say is it's incredibly floaty in terms of its flight model. So we'll come off the brakes, feeding in the throttles. Looking good there on the RPMs. Almost immediately the tail wanting to come up. We're not even through 60 kilometers an hour at the moment. And already the aircraft feeling very floaty. I would say very, very floaty and takes a long time for the controls to respond. And we were airborne well before 112 kilometers an hour there. So the flight model to me, obviously I've never flown a Fokker F7, but it feels quite bizarre, frankly. Come back slightly on the throttles there. Come back to our 2050 on the RPMs. And we'll climb around 130 kilometers an hour. It seems reasonable. Try trimming the aircraft. I'm not sure whether the Fokker F7 actually has trim. It seems at least this particular version does. So that makes flying the aircraft obviously a little bit easier. Normally I like to pull off a good takeoff or landing in my videos, but I thought I'd leave that one in just to really showcase how bizarre the aircraft actually is. I'm sure if I gave it a few more attempts I could refine it a little bit, but overall it just handles very strangely during the takeoff. As I said, very floaty, and it takes the controls a long time to respond, so it's quite hard to actually correct once the aircraft deviates from the flight path that you want. Anyway, as I said, we'll head over towards Sydney, so we'll make a turn out towards the north. And that brings me on to another point, the compass, which we've already discussed a little bit. It seems to be that the compass just reads by the top of the T there, pointing onto our heading. At the very least, it's pretty inaccurate way of actually judging your heading. That could be a period accurate instrument, I'm not entirely sure, but obviously you can only really tell within probably 10 degrees either side of your actual heading what heading you're actually doing. So that would make navigating the aircraft pretty tricky, I would say. Anyway, cruise power is between 1850 and 2000 RPM, so we'll come back to 2000. And obviously it's not going to be a long run out towards Sydney, but we'll briefly head outside the aircraft so that you can see the external modelling again of the Fokker F7 now that we're airborne. And I'll come back to you once we're overhead the city. We'll do our lap around the area. I'll try and point out some of the sites as we go, although I'm certainly no local expert. But I do have a map to hand, so hopefully we can make a little bit of a tour. Okay, so welcome back to the cockpit. We're just approaching Sydney Harbour at the moment. I think we're just coming over Darling Point. We've got Piper Point just off the nose, and Shark Island just further on from that. At our 2000 RPM, we're doing about 140 kilometres an hour here in the cruise. I'm not entirely sure how representative that might be of the real-world aircraft. Another little island just off Darling Point. No name of that on the map. And just off the nose over the other side of the bay here we've got Taronga Zoo apparently. I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to see much there, but we won't head too far north at any rate. Visibility in the aircraft is nothing special. Obviously we've got those two fairly sizable engines on either side, and then we've got the engine up front as well. The panoramic view out the front's pretty nice, but yeah, not the best aircraft for sightseeing by any means. The flight model does feel a tiny bit better now that we're actually up at cruise speed and in the cruise. Generally speaking, it still feels pretty lightweight. And again, rather strange on the controls, but it does feel now a little bit more responsive at least. And it's reasonably stable, but it still needs quite a lot of manual intervention to keep it where you want it. I would expect that that's probably fairly accurate. Anyway, obviously we've got the two most famous Sydney landmarks, I would say. We've got the Sydney Opera House just passing off the left-hand engine there. We've got the Sydney Harbour Bridge as well, passing just off our 10 o'clock. I think we're going to have to do a little bit of a flyby under that. Then of course we've got the city of Sydney itself. Again, we'll take a closer look at that once we've come around the bridge. Beautiful scenery though, and the photogrammetry as well, very nice. I noticed when we're down at Point Cook, the photo imagery for the area seemed to be very good quality as well. So I think the Australian update, a really nice addition to the sim. Australia is a beautiful country and very interesting place to fly in. Got the Australian flag there up on the top of Sydney Harbour Bridge. And off in the distance, just off the top of the left engine, you can see the Anzac Bridge. We'll fly a little bit further towards that just so we can take a look, and then we'll come back towards the harbour bridge itself. As you can see, they're a really beautiful area. Actually having to roll the aircraft out there, needing pretty large control inputs, but that's probably true to life. So we'll come back on the power, lose some altitude for our flyby of the bridge. Having to use quite a bit of backstick now. The aircraft really wanting to drop out of the sky now that we've come back off the power. Unfortunately, my map doesn't detail too many of the buildings in the city itself. I can see the, I don't know the actual name of it, but the Westfield Tower. So we'll come down under Harbour Bridge, we'll do a flyby of the Opera House, and then we'll do a quick tour through the city before we head back towards Sydney International. I can't say I'm really enjoying flying the aircraft all that much so far, which is a real shame. It's okay, but again, it's quite strange in terms of handling. It's, yeah, just not the most enjoyable aircraft to fly, I have to say. Got some sort of amusement park down on the left, according to the map. That's Luna Park. You can see a Ferris wheel. So coming up on the power, Opera House just off on our right. We'll come back up to 2000 RPM. The aircraft's just all over the place, so it's quite happy to move around in any direction, but again the control responses are so slow. To some degree I'm sure the control response on the Fokker F7 is not stellar. Nonetheless, I don't expect it would feel this wallowy. Just coming up on the engine power again there, losing a bit of speed. The aircraft wanting to drop. Main road passing just down below us. I think the train station's out to the south of the city. We'll see if we can't spot that. There's the Westfield Tower that I just mentioned. Again, I'm not sure of the actual name of the tower, I'm afraid. I think those are the railway lines just coming into the city off at our 1 o'clock. And we've got a little bit of altitude in hand again now. Building up some speed, we'll come back to 2000 RPM. In fairness, we are probably fairly heavy here at the moment. We've got the stock standard 50% fuel, which of course, talking in terms of transatlantic flights and those sorts of endeavours, is probably quite a lot of fuel. So the aircraft is going to perform less well as a result, I would imagine, but again, I don't think that really accounts for the overall behaviour of the flight model. And as always, just bear in mind, all of this is purely my own conjecture. I've never flown an aircraft even remotely like this, but I think I can say with reasonable degree of certainty that the F7 didn't fly as it currently is in the sim. So we'll just do one quick pass through the centre of Sydney itself, and then we'll make our way back towards the airport. I think we've done a pretty good run there of the overall handling characteristics. For the sake of interest, we might just put it through a couple more manoeuvres once we make our way back towards the airport. You can see some of the older Victorian architecture down there on our left. Now we've got, I think, St James's Park just down below us. Looks like we've got a carrier as well just out at our 10 o'clock. Not sure which carrier that would be. But a few naval vessels down there. Anyway, we'll start to turn back out towards the airfield. We've got the Allianz Stadium, I think that is, just off the nose. So we'll head out towards that, we'll overfly the stadium and then we'll head back towards Sydney Kingsford Smith. Okay, so we're just coming up again and being the airport. We're just on a left-hand downwind at the moment, back for runway 07. As I said, I thought we'd try a few more manoeuvres just to try and demonstrate the aircraft's flight modelling a little bit more. First of all, we're just going to come up to full power on the engines. I think the sounds are a little bit better. So a little bit more of a roar as we do so. You can see the gauges do peg at 2500 RPM there. But we get a lot more performance out of the aircraft. I'm not sure whether or not it's accurate, whether or not you can run the engines at 2500 RPM. Again, with no documentation, it's very difficult to say, but we've got some pretty decent altitude in hand now, so we'll come back to a cruise power setting once again. And we'll just go for some full control deflections, just to try and show you a little bit more how the flight model actually behaves. So go full rudder out to the left, producing a lot of roll there, which again may be accurate, but the aircraft just so wallowy. That's me just oscillating the rudders at the moment. It just feels like there's very little damping from the aircraft. The aircraft taking quite a long time to get settled down there as well, but again that may be accurate. Similarly, we'll try full left deflection on the ailerons. Quite a bit of induced yaw there. And again, the aircraft very slow to respond on the controls. I've got full right now on the aileron. And back to full left. Still got full left aileron here at the moment. And it almost feels like the aircraft reaches a limit. That's still full left aileron. We're not really increasing our angle of bank. Just keeping an eye on the runway. So we're just coming up beam runway 07. Take ourselves back onto runway heading. Obviously the Fokker F7 is a classic aircraft. It's really designed around the early days of aviation, so I'm sure it would have had a lot of handling peculiarities and not necessarily been the easiest of aircraft to fly, but I'm pretty confident again that the flight model is quite off at the moment. Anyway, once again we'll just come back up to full power, we'll try a stall and then we'll make our way back for a landing. So again, according to the checklist, we wanted 112 kilometers an hour at rotation. We stalled around 80 there. The nose dropping, the stall behaviour pretty placid overall. That actually went a little bit better than I was expecting. The aircraft felt reasonable in the stall. Nothing special by any means, but at least it behaves broadly as you would expect. Just try that again. So fully back on the stick. The nose dropping quite violently there. So coming back up to full power. I would say for the type of flight model and the price point, that's reasonable behaviour from the aircraft. And I do feel like I'm starting to get the hang of how the aircraft flies a little bit now. Definitely need to coordinate rudder and aileron. So it's quite a hands-on aircraft in that respect. But again, I don't think it's just my iffy flying skills that account for the flight model peculiarities. Anyway, we'll head back towards the airport. We'll try a landing. I can only imagine that's going to be quite an interesting experience. According to the checklist, we want to be 120 kilometers an hour down final approach, touching down around 110 and then fully back on the stick around 60. So we're a little bit fast here at the moment, so we'll let the speed come off. Pretty straightforward in terms of the landing process. Obviously we've got a fixed gear, no flaps to worry about either. The aircraft's very straightforward to fly in that respect. It's really a case of just start the engines, then you've got the throttles and the primary flight controls, and that's pretty much all you've got. Obviously we do have some flight instrumentation, but it's pretty basic, unless of course you're using the retrofitted version of the aircraft. Quite hard to lose speed in the aircraft as well. We'll come back to idle power momentarily. Just trimming the aircraft again as the speed falls off. We're a little bit high here at the moment according to the PAPIs, but I'm not too worried about that. Pretty sure we're going to be able to correct, and we've got tons of runway here for the F7. Also we've got that nice strong headwind. So I'm imagining the aircraft's going to handle much as it did during the takeoff at low speed. Probably going to be very floaty, quite hard to control, but we'll try our best to get it down in a reasonable fashion. We're on speed according to the checklist, and so far the aircraft's okay. Still a little bit high here at the moment. We'll go for a smooth landing as opposed to the touchdown zone. Initially I'm going to try and avoid braking as well. We'll see whether or not the skid actually helps to slow us down. And look at the windsock there, pretty much straight down the runway, so it should be fairly easy in that regard. There's our 110 just coming over the threshold. We'll maintain that until touchdown. So coming back on the stick, holding the aircraft off, losing all elevator authority there as the speed came back through about 100 knots. Just about got away with it. The landing was reasonably smooth, but the aircraft pretty much fell out of the sky once we reached 100 knots. Anyway, we're back through 60 now, so all the way back on the yoke. And we'll vacate off to the next right. Okay, so we're back at our parking spot. Again, the ground handling of the aircraft, overall it's workable. It's a little bit strange, but obviously we are trying to model a skid aircraft here in a sim. And I imagine in reality as well you make more use of differential engine power settings. Nonetheless, we managed to get the aircraft back to the bay relatively easily. So once again the chocks are set. We've been running the engines for a few minutes here just to cool down. Throttles can come back to idle. The checklist actually calls for the mixtures to go off, and again I can't find any mixture levers in the cockpit. So all we'll do is just turn our magnetos off one at a time. Good shutdown there on the left. And the same on the centre engine. And on the right. Lastly, we'll just get all of our fuel levers off once again. And that's our shutdown checklist complete. As usual, just to finish up the review, I'll run through my overall thoughts on the Asobo Orbx Fokker F7. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our outing in the Asobo Orbx Fokker F7. I don't think that there's a career as a tour guide ahead of me, but I think we managed to take a pretty decent look at the aircraft. As usual, I'll try and summarise what I think of the product. We'll start with our negatives, work our way through to the positives. I will say though that in this particular case, I think unfortunately I have quite a few more negative points to give against the F7 as opposed to positives. So starting with the negatives, and again unfortunately quite a lot here to say. For me the biggest issue by far with the aircraft currently is the flight model. Again stipulating that of course it is conjecture on my part, but I'm pretty sure there's some major issues with the flight model at the moment. For me the F7 feels almost weightless and it has a very strange inertia to it. Particularly during the takeoff the aircraft behaved very strangely, the tail lifting off almost immediately and the aircraft very difficult to control. As I said, once we're up at cruise speed it was a little bit easier to fly, reasonably stable overall. Not entirely unpleasant, but not particularly fun aircraft to fly. And as we discussed during the flight, not a particularly enjoyable one either, I would say. On the approach the aircraft mostly felt good until we got to low speed and then we pretty much lost all elevator authority. As you'll have probably seen for yourselves with the replay of the landing, during the flare we went full backstick, the aircraft just dropped onto the runway. That I found to be particularly strange though, as the aircraft's tail was still wanting to lift off the ground even at very low speed. Usually I have to say I find it quite tricky to critique the flight models of Microsoft Flight Simulator. Of course they all have their issues, but generally speaking I feel that most aircraft in the sim actually fly quite nicely. Unfortunately though with this one that's really not the case, again at least to my mind. The aircraft's flight model is just bizarre at the end of the day. The aircraft systems as well, as we've seen, again quite difficult to say without any documentation, which once again we seem to have another Asobo aircraft with pretty much zero documentation, at least that I could find. But anyway, the systems, I think quite a few inaccuracies there. We looked at the fuel system, I can't believe that that's accurate. And it seemed to me as well that some of the gauges are not currently correct, at least in terms of the scales on the dials. Some of the in-sim checklists also don't align with the aircraft systems, a more minor detail, but for example starting the starboard engine, the checklist actually calls for you to crank the centre engine. And as I said, on the Southern Cross variant at least, I couldn't find a way of starting the engines without bringing the mixtures up using a hardware keybind. Lastly, as we discussed during the startup, the RPM behaviour seemed to be quite strange when carrying out a manual start versus the control-E start. So basically, just be aware that the aircraft systems are fairly light in terms of fidelity, which is probably not a surprise, but also fairly buggy at the moment. Again, as we discussed during the startup, I think currently the best method of starting the aircraft is to use Control-E. We just touched on it, but again, I couldn't find any documentation included with the aircraft, which is pretty disappointing. We saw the same with the Ju-52. It can often be difficult to find documentation on these classic aircraft, so you're often left using guesswork to fly the aeroplane. And really, once again, there's a bit of a lack of features on the aircraft, the inability to open the aircraft doors, the lack of option to get into the aircraft cabin from the cockpit. All of that seems a little bit strange to me. It's not entirely surprising with an Asobo offering, but I don't understand why they omit these features from an aircraft. We certainly expect that sort of functionality in Microsoft Flight Simulator, but really we've had that sort of functionality since Microsoft Flight Simulator 2002. Anyway, the flight model isn't great, the systems aren't particularly good either, and there is certainly a lack of functionality on the aircraft, so that pretty much covers off my major negatives. Sounds I'm going to put somewhere in the middle, as I think some of the sounds were quite good, others were a little bit meek. In terms of positives, that really comes down to the modelling and the texturing. I think that's particularly strong externally. Internally it's still good, but not quite to the same standard. And once again, I do like the amount of variation we get with the aircraft, particularly the fact that we get both the single engine and the tri-engine version. There's a nice selection of liveries as well, and of course it's always nice to have a piece of history in the sim. Unfortunately though, for me it's going to be quite difficult to enjoy all of that, since I can't see myself flying the aircraft again until the flight model's been fixed up. As I said, and again this is just my personal opinion, but I didn't find the aircraft all that enjoyable to fly unfortunately. There are certainly many other add-ons in the sim, including the JE52, that I think we could have had a lot more fun taking around the city. If I had to guess, I think the aircraft's been rushed to release. Obviously Asobo wanted to release the Fokker F7 alongside the World Update 7. As a result, I think there's been quite a few things left unfinished, hence why we're seeing so many inaccuracies and bugs in the aircraft systems, and probably why we're seeing quite a strange flight model as well. So the aircraft, unfortunately at the moment, I think a little bit of a flop. Conversely though, we'll touch on it, I'm actually really happy with World Update 7, I think Asobo have done a really nice job with that. I've only had a look at Sydney and Melbourne myself so far, but the cities seem to be done very nicely. As I mentioned, the satellite imagery seems to be much improved, and there seems to be a lot of interesting points to go visit. I'm sure we'll take a look at some of those in later flights. Anyway guys, as always I do hope you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a huge thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It's very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, enjoy World Update 7, and I will see you all again soon.